Hi, my name is Jessica and I'm a Vital graduate. After I completed the Vital 12-month program, I went on to open up my own plant business here in the Netherlands, offering legal psilocybin sessions, ceremonies, and retreat, alongside educational and integration support for people that literally come from all over the world to have the opportunity to sit with plant medicine here in a legal setting. So besides that, I started to work with Microdosing Institute as well as a co-facilitator and explore more collaborations within the psychedelic space. And some of those collaborations actually came out from the people that I got to know through the Vital program. I also started to expand more of the educational work that I do with women of psychedelics. And next year, we'll be providing more ceremonies and sessions and retreats besides online and in-person events for all women from all over the world. For me, the most rewarding part of this work is actually that I can bring all sides of me to what I do. If you are interested in getting involved in the psychedelic world and making a meaningful shift in your life, visit vitalpsychedelictraining.com for more information on joining the next cohort.
Are you working in psychedelics or taking steps to get involved? Lately, we've been thinking about the future of this field, the people who are going to work with psychedelics, and how they're going to show up. So we decided to ask them. Here's what we heard from people in a new survey who are working in psychedelics right now or preparing to launch their careers. 87.6% have been influenced by their own positive experiences with psychedelics. While 47% are incorporating psychedelics into an existing career, 31.6% are switching careers entirely. And not surprisingly, making money is not the goal. A staggering 98.3% of respondents indicate that making a lot of money is not their primary motivation to enter the field. If you're curious to learn more about this growing space and perhaps find your place in it, we're inviting you to download our new 24-page report, The Emerging Psychedelic Workforce. It's packed with insights on the field you won't find anywhere else, and it's completely free. You can find it in the articles section of our website at psychedelicstoday.com/article titled The Emerging Psychedelic Workforce.
Hello and welcome everyone. I am so excited for our today's discussion on psychedelic chaplaincy and spiritual care. And today I have with me here some very, very special folks, current teachers and previous students of the Vital program. So in a moment, I'm gonna let them make their introductions, but I just wanted to briefly introduce myself. So my name is Johanna and I'm the coordinator of education and training here at Vital. I also have a background in psychology as well as a master's in religious studies. So I have always been very curious about these questions of religion and spirituality and how they relate to psychedelics and how our psychedelic experiences may inform religious practices and vice versa. So it is such a pleasure for me to embark on this, what I believe to be very, very rich discussion about interfaith practices and spirituality and psychedelic experiences and everything that we will cover. Let's see what comes up. So I'm going to be handing it over to you, Aura, to make your introductions. Please feel free to take your time. We really want to find out as much about you and your journey to becoming a rabbi and to becoming a psychedelic practitioner. So over to you.
Thank you, Johanna. And let me just say what a pleasure it is to be able to serve with this this wonderful group of people. I'm just so excited to be able to spend quality time thinking and discussing with all of you. So I am going to interweave both my professional and personal stories because they dovetail in important ways that continue to inform what I do today. I decided to become a rabbi as sort of a midlife decision. I didn't see it coming when I was younger. And in fact, grew up feeling more or less something of an atheist. I wasn't very interested in having conversations about God, and just my interests lay elsewhere. However, after my children were born, I can think of one really significant foundational experience that I had. It came one night at a conference. I was attending a Jewish educational conference and had heard some material that day that really touched me in a deep and personal way, as I was a new mother, and my husband and I found a way to bring our very young son to this conference, and we were spotting each other as we went to these classes. And this one class really touched on what for me was the heart of parenting, of holding responsibility for another little life. And I was sort of marinating in all of these thoughts, and they were swirling around with my identity as a Jewish person. And in a way that really was eating at me. That night, I found myself alone in my dorm room. I had just tucked my baby son into bed. The lights were out. My husband was, out with friends having a beer, and I found myself starting to cry and then sob. And in that moment, I started crying out to the God that until that very moment I did not believe in. And I started bringing all kinds of questions. And after that night, I found a new, to my surprise, relationship or sense of connection with the divine that just hadn't appeared before, but suddenly it was there. And that connection has remained. It's been an abiding connection from that point to today. And it really was probably the first step in my path of deciding ultimately to become a rabbi. Now I'd like to, and I was ordained as a rabbi with an organization called ALEPH, the Alliance for Jewish Renewal, which is not a bricks and mortar seminary, but rather a seminary of the cloud that has us as students attend in intensives. And what I really love about that program, I was ordained almost 10 years ago, which was that it demanded that we bring our whole selves to this endeavor of spiritual development and growth. So it wasn't just an education from the neck up. It wasn't just focused on intellectually what can we acquire and learn and study and grow from, even though that's a crucial portion of it. It also demanded that we bring our full emotionality into our experiences and really integrate what we were feeling with what we were learning. And more than that, it demanded that we get in touch with that sense of soul, of spirituality, and really see what it feels like to be in that space. And as we were learning on an intellectual level, what does it feel like to grow in that spiritual space? And then there's the level, of course, of integration of all of those three dimensions into what we call Atzilut, or the highest level of soul development in Jewish Renewal. So that was my education, and I spent many years working in the pulpit. And then at the start of COVID, my husband and I decided to move back to what was home for us, Ann Arbor, Michigan, where we still had many, many friends and community. And it was at that time that I began to do more work on self, tending to some of the underlying issues that had always been there, but I hadn't really had the opportunity or the time to really devote to that certain level of inner work. And it was around that time that I discovered psychedelics. And I began using them, employing them, as a means of attaining a level of awareness and discovery and an avenue for growth that just had not been opened up to me until that very point. And I was so blown away by the power of psychedelics to really open us up and help us heal and provide new new avenues of growth, that I decided to leave pulpit work. I still do it freelance part-time, but I started a new practice that I call the Psychedelic Rabbi. You can find it at psychedelicrabbi.com. And in that practice, I work with clients. I live in a decriminalized county in my state of Michigan. And in that practice, I work with people to prepare for a journey. I work with people afterwards to integrate from a journey. And I'm really excited about the possibilities that psychedelics open us up to in terms of spiritual development and growth. So this is my new passion, and this is where I'm choosing to work.
Incredible. Thank you so much, Ora, for sharing your journey with us. And I am just so excited to see how your work will evolve. So, Josh, over to you.
Thank you, Johanna. My name is Josh Harper. I live on Ohlone land in California, also known as Oakland, California. I grew up in a tradition of the Christian church that the Pentecostal charismatic tradition. And what's unique about that is they emphasize the work of the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, in and amongst people and individuals and in the community. So I grew up with church services that had somewhat ecstatic experiences, people speaking in tongues and being almost fainting in feeling overwhelmed by the Spirit, people prophesying. So mystical experiences were normalized for me growing up, and it just felt normal. I had some of these ecstatic experiences of my own. And when it came time to go to college, I really recognized that my religion was something that was handed to me by my parents, that I grew up in. I was very open at that point to see and experience what else might be there. And in college, I was met with a whole series of synchronicities, met up and connected to this really wonderful, beloved community of folks, another Christian community. And it was a place to be seen, a place where you could be your authentic self, a place to heal. And I loved that community, and I loved being a part of it. I loved offering space for other people to come and be a part of that community, to come and heal. And when it came time to graduate, I didn't really want to do much else other than keep doing what we were doing within this group. And so I decided to work for them a couple of years as an intern and then full time. And it was shortly after that where I had another big revelation or evolution in my faith, where there was a racial incident on our campus, and some of the students of color came to the staff and said, "What are you going to do about this?" And we didn't have a very good answer for that. And they said, "Well, you better do something, because when part of the body hurts, the whole body hurts." And that's an allusion to a verse in one of Paul's letters about the body of Christ. And so we really sought after, like, what do we do about this? What does our faith tell us about issues of justice? And in fact, it talks a lot about that. Our scriptures talk a lot about that, but it's not always emphasized in the American church, especially the American evangelical church. So that started a whole new quest for me of learning and growing, studying our sacred text to hear about how does God care about justice and about people on the margins. And that started me bringing students to Oakland, where I currently live, and to learn from people doing really innovative ministry, people who've been doing work on the ground for many years. And I loved that experiential learning format, bringing students into this experience, really disorienting their whole framework and understanding of God and the world, and then helping them reintegrate into something, reorient to something new and integrate that into their lives. And so that's became the focus of my whole career. I moved to Oakland. I ran a program, an experiential program on social justice. Eventually, we included issues of the environmental issues and environmental justice. Then I became the national director of those programs. Also, I should add that this organization is a pretty big tent, and it really afforded opportunity to grow in other traditions in the Christian faith. One of those is the contemplative tradition. And so we would often, every semester, have these retreats, and we'd go do centering prayer and contemplative prayer. And that was really foundational for me too. My role also afforded me the opportunity to go on pilgrimage. And so we went to Assisi, Italy, and learned about the lives of St. Francis and St. Clare. I began leading students on pilgrimage on the Camino de Santiago, the walking pilgrimage in northern Spain, which itself is almost like a psychedelic experience, is really wonderful. And that began to shape and form my spiritual life as well. When COVID happened, the Camino trip was canceled, and so we pivoted and began creating audio-guided pilgrimages around Camino and eventually Celtic spirituality, eventually Francis and Clare, Franciscan spirituality, and most recently one on indigenous North American, Turtle Island and Hawaii, in the indigenous spirituality that we find here. So my journey has brought me deep into the contemplative, deep into historic mysticism within the Christian church. My own another thread of my journey is just feeling disenchanted by the institution of the church, especially the American evangelical church. My own deconstruction process of that, which led me to be intrigued by what psychedelics could offer. And so several years ago, I had the opportunity to try some mushrooms and had a pretty incredible experience. It broke open things for me personally. I feel like it made me a better father, a better husband, and it really was this deep personal experience of the divine. And I felt like it was completely compatible with my Christian faith that was evolving and changing. And it really met me at a time when I needed to start reconstructing something after my deconstruction process. So that's what I'm offering now to people. I'm working as an integration coach and helping people prepare and integrate their experiences, even working with people to facilitate their experience. And it's exciting and it's a little scary, and I'm loving it. I feel like I'm stepping into what I've been called to do.
Thank you so much, Josh, and for all the work that you do. I mean, you were in my study group during the first year of Vital, and I just immediately felt this sort of kinship and connection. I also have a Pentecostal home, and my family is coming from that tradition, and my father is a pastor, and I felt like we just had this mutual understanding that, there's so much that psychedelics can do in the Christian space, and so much healing that can happen through this space that doesn't even maybe necessarily recognize that it needs this kind of healing. And it's completely revolutionary. So it's amazing to have you along with the journey, on this journey. So
Can I add one more thing, Johanna?
100%.
Yeah, Ara and I met on our Vital retreat in Colorado, doing breath work together. So I have vivid memories over meals with the Christian minister and the rabbi talking about spirituality and psychedelics. And those were the start of a meaningful and rich friendship that continues even to this day. So I wanted to make sure that people saw that connection or heard that connection.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. Okay, well, Dan, over to you then.
Yeah, thank you, Johanna, and thank you, Josh and Aura. It's really wonderful to kind of like get to know you like this. We've not met each other before. We've sent some emails to each other, but this is a very intimate introduction, even though I'm well aware that many people might be listening to this. My name is Daan Keiman. I grew up and I live in the Netherlands. I grew up in a coastal town, so I feel very connected to the dunes of the Netherlands. It's a very particular type of nature, and my ancestry roots there and goes back many generations. Living on the land there. I have the feeling that I come from a sort of inverse. If I compare my life story with those of Aura and Josh, the family I just mentioned was Catholic, but my grandmother comes from a family of 16 children, and the pastor would be knocking on the door every time a child was about 9-10 months ago that one was born, when the next one would come. And so my grandmother grew up with a profound disliking of the church, became a very fervent atheist. And on my father's side as well, there's a more Spinozian understanding of spirituality, but my dad's a biology teacher, so I grew up without any form of spirituality in a quite heavy sort of science household, in a very sort of like middle-class town in the Netherlands, where the spiritual quality was primarily one of boredom and emptiness and lack. That probably resulted in me starting to take psychedelics when I was 16 and exploring a lot of different substances. I think Dale Pendell calls psychedelics a medicine for a cure worse than cancer, which is boredom. His writings inspired me when I was quite young. I started to read all the psychedelic authors, Timothy Leary and Terence McKenna and Dale Pendell. I was fascinated. Also relevant to know, I have COVID, so if you hear me snotter or cough or sneeze, please bear with me as I move through this particular psychedelic journey.
We're so appreciative that you're still doing this with
yes,
us, by the way.
yeah. But yeah, so I think if I reflect on my childhood and adolescence and early adulthood, it's one that is much more ungrounded, not grounded in tradition, not so grounded in myself, and there were a lot of problems in both sides of the family. And so in retrospect, I understand my deep longing or yearning almost for some sort of transcendental quality or experience that I looked for through extreme sports, through psychedelics, and eventually I started having experiences with psychedelics that kind of provoked a deep interest in consciousness. And decided to study sociology and anthropology. Initially started to study drug policies, discovered that drug policies are terrible in most parts of the world, even though the Netherlands is fairly okay. In sociology, I got exposed to theories of social constructivism. And those theories can be somewhat upsetting because they basically say nothing about you is actually yours. Even the thoughts that you think are in a language that was never yours. It was given to you by your ancestors, and you will pass it on. And you have this luxury position where you take it in, but that's about it. most of the behavior can be understood through a lens of cultural analysis, and that can be a difficult thing to be in as a student. At one point, there emerged jokes along the lines of your mom is a social construct, your food is a social construct, everything is a social construct. And then one teacher says, well, the Buddhists really take this to the next level, and they say yourself is a social construct, and is completely constructed. There's no one at home. So I kind of took that in, and it hinted at something that I had some sort of approximation of with some of my psychedelic experiences. But still, I was very much partying, going out, trying all these compounds. I was fascinated by the books Pikal and Tikal, written by the Shoguns, that lists hundreds and hundreds of different psychoactive compounds. And in my naive enthusiasm, I had sort of this intention, like, let's try all of this. Quite quickly started to see that people can get really hurt. And I had, lost a friend to an overdose, and saw some real gnarly shit in the scene. And engaged in quite some harm reduction work. So peer-to-peer drug harm reduction on festivals and parties, and going to fraternities to talk about alcohol use. And that slowly brought me into a line of work where I was just very enthusiastic about thinking about drugs and drug policies, but very much on a societal level. Until I had a complete sort of existential crisis, a relationship that ended, a friend that betrayed me, my housing situation became uncertain, serious health complications, and I couldn't finish my master's degree. I was very close, like nearly wrote my thesis, and I got stuck, and I was writing on Zen Buddhism because that fascinated me at the time. And at that point, realized I'm going to change something in my life, and then discovered that there was another master's degree in Amsterdam, the city that I lived, where they taught Buddhist chaplaincy. And at this point in time, I was already practicing with my root teacher that I met through a series of synchronicities, and things just, in Dutch we say, got into sort of accelerated and deepened quite quickly. I started to read a lot of the Buddhist texts and sutras. I lived with my teacher for a while to deepen my practice. I engaged in monastic training. And all the things that they taught in sociology and all those psychedelic experiences suddenly started to make much more sense. And then I started to realize that if I wanted to keep working with psychedelics, that I needed to shift how I was relating to them from something that was recreational to something that was actually centering my spiritual practice. That's also around the time that I got in touch with an Umbandaimi church. At the time, ayahuasca was still legal in the Netherlands. And so, I got exposed to a particular form of ayahuasca use that blended in a really beautiful way with my spiritual practice. My Buddhist teacher encouraged me to keep exploring, just never rely on the psychedelics alone. That was his only hard limit, was like, don't rely on psychedelics. Understand that you don't need them, but if they're useful, then use them, but use them wisely and anchor them in your vows, anchor them in why you're doing this. And after that, very slowly, friends started to ask me if I could hold space for them. At one point, that moved into Buddhist practitioners asking if I could hold space for them because people started to get interested in psychedelics. at one point, a friend of mine asked me if I wanted to come and work for his organization, and this is Synthesis. So I became one of the lead facilitators there. Quite quickly also started building a health screening team, eventually became the director of ethics and advocacy, and the director of program and product development towards the end. Unfortunately, Synthesis has imploded, but it transformed into something new. So I'm still somewhat affiliated with the current iteration of Synthesis. But it's been an absolute honor to learn from so many of my colleagues and work with so many different people. I've had the pleasure of traveling quite a lot and sitting ceremony with some people from the Shipibo tradition, and from different Brazilian traditions, a lot of Umbandaimi work. Here I am, I guess. I try to combine Buddhist chaplaincy and interfaith spiritual care with psychedelic care. And I think that's where we'll start to talk more. Oh, and I keep wanting to say this. I identify as queer and neurodivergent, and I usually say this for the sake of visibility, that folks know that they're not alone. I wanted to hear that when I was much younger. Yeah, so I'll leave it at that.
Thank you all so much. I just absolutely loved hearing from each and every one of you to just get this kind of sense. And I just, for me, all of you three have this sort of, like, you really have this very peaceful presence. And I think it sort of speaks for the kind of connection that you each have to your own practice. And it's just so special to have you all here at once, representing, well, not representing, but just representing yourself, of course, but also being part of a very particular tradition that, you know, typically are not maybe so much in communion, and especially not under the umbrella of psychedelics. So let's get going with our discussion for today. And first, I wanted to ask you about this term of psychedelic chaplaincy. It's relatively new, and I think a lot of people also don't really even know what it means and what it might look like in practice. So I wanted to ask, how do you relate to this term psychedelic chaplaincy? How do you define it for yourself, and what role does it play in your life? And whoever feels called to go first, you just go ahead.
You know what? Shall I just take a stab at this? Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways of looking at psychedelic chaplaincy, but maybe as a whole, I would say it's a form of psychedelic care where the focus or the emphasis is placed on the spiritual or existential dimension of one's experience. And I would like to add that the way that I tend to approach it is through a very somatic, relational, and existential lens. So it's kind of like these three dimensions deeply intersect. I think meaning, the way that we make sense of the world, is expressed in how we move through the world, how we are in the world, and how we embody our values and our orientation to life. My father's side has a lot of Jewish heritage, but I'm very curious what you would say, Ora, because for me, meaning is also deeply relational. It's about the relationship we have to our own parts, to the other, to the transpersonal, to in what in Buddhism we call the sort of like ultimate ground of reality, awareness itself. And so, yeah, this existential thread that runs through psychedelic chaplaincy, I see it as the thread that holds all the other things together: the therapeutic, the somatic, the relational. It's like it's how we make sense of our experiences, or how we come to terms with the fact that it didn't make sense. And we might offer our clients ways of making sense of a psychedelic experience without making it too rigid, or become very comfortable with an experience not making sense and staying curious about it and having this sort of radical openness towards the mystery and the fact that there's things that we might not know, and that we want to discover over time. So yeah, I think it pertains to values, meaning making, and how we make sense of these experiences.
Dan, that was really beautiful, and I feel like it was so eloquently said. There's nothing I could say that was also a very well-rounded definition. I really, really liked it. All I'd like to say is, coming from a Jewish lens, through a Jewish perspective, there are some sort of core concepts that I weave into my thinking around this notion of what psychedelic chaplaincy has the potential to offer. One of them comes from the word in Hebrew for heart, lev, which we encounter many times throughout Torah, the Hebrew Bible. And according to traditional understanding of what is heart, what is lev, it was always understood to be the inextricably linked unity of both thoughts and emotions, things that are, in other words, intangible. And that is sort of a core ingredient that we're working with, I think, in psychedelic chaplaincy. It isn't just about working with people's thoughts. It isn't just working with people around what feelings are arising, but it's sort of the, what arises out of the interweaving of those things. It can sort of become more than the sum of its parts. There's some emergence there. The second word that came to mind speaks to a different approach around psychedelic chaplaincy, and that word is Yisrael. Yisrael is the Hebrew word traditionally interpreted to mean the people of Israel. Yisrael means Israel, but Yisrael is also the new name that Jacob is given in the Torah, in the Hebrew Bible, once he acquires a certain level of awareness. He is given a second name, and that name is Yisrael. And throughout tradition, it's been noted that this word Yisrael can be teased apart into two separate words. And one of those ways of doing that are to separate it into the two-word phrase Yisra, El. Yisra is the verb that means to wrestle with, and El is one of many names of the divine. Judaism has many, many names of God, and El is one of them. So Yisrael is the name that means God wrestlers. We are a people who wrestle with the divine, whatever that means. So Yisrael is an approach, a way of trying to learn and understand through wrestling. And we wrestle intellectually, but we also wrestle emotionally. We bring our whole selves into that task of wrestling. And Yisrael is also, in a sense, a reminder that we are all connected, because Yisrael was the name of our progenitor. And in that sense, metaphorically, I think it's trying to remind us that we are all interconnected. We are all related. And we aren't, at no point are we operating individualistically, even if it feels like we're all alone at any given point.
Thanks, Aura. Both of you really define that in an excellent way. I appreciate that. I have just a little bit to add. I'm a little reluctant to use that phrase, chaplaincy, because it is something that it's a protected term, usually meant to describe someone who's gone through a certain training. I know in certain places there's a licensing for that. I don't have that licensing and training. And I have a friend who's a hospital chaplain who's writing 30 essays and going before a board to talk about what her chaplaincy. But one key aspect of it that in my practice that I take from this idea of chaplaincy is just that abiding, loving presence, and non-judgmental, curious, and both in experiences and in that meaning-making time. Another practice within Christianity or something that is in the Catholic tradition and in some Protestant traditions is that of spiritual direction. And I see parallels to chaplaincy there of just being a place to listen and for people to process and to gently guide and help them make meaning. And so I see some parallels to spiritual direction, to the abiding presence. And but I also want to acknowledge that there are some rigorous trainings and I don't have that. And so I'm reluctant to use it, but I do appreciate the framework, and it does inform the work that I do.
Thank you all. I guess we're going to have to wait a little while before we get those licensing boards for psychedelic chaplaincy. So, yeah, but I mean, do you think it is without sort of having that kind of licensure? I mean, for instance, Dan, you've got the master's background in the spiritual care sector, and I assume that is also kind of a protected title. But how do you see this sort of way for people to start practicing spiritual care without the existence of these kinds of boards, and you know, who's got the right to do that, and how can it be something that is made more available to people while we are in this transitory period when psychedelics are still not part of the mainstream?
There's a couple of dimensions to your question. In the Netherlands, to call yourself a chaplain or a spiritual caregiver is actually not a protected title. You can get accredited, but there too there's some challenges because is this actually chaplaincy work, right? Guiding people through psychedelic experiences. And I think it would be fruitful for our field to ask a couple of questions or to bring in some to bring some clarity to thinking about this topic. One of them is to ask, where do chaplains actually come in? And so the first question that I would have is, are we talking about people that have no background in offering chaplaincy, ministry, spiritual care, or any form of spiritual direction, as Josh just said? I think that's a completely different group of people. They might be interested in psychedelic chaplaincy, but they will be lacking a lot of the core competencies that you need to just have a good, quote-unquote, good conversation with a client about spirituality. There's a lot of ethics that come in. There's a lot of skill that comes in. Plus, there's a requirement to be rooted in some tradition that could be humanistic, that could be Judaistic. That it doesn't really matter, but you need some sort of existential grounding, so to speak, spiritual grounding, religious grounding. For spiritual caregivers, I would say that for them to support clients in the integration process, especially, is a beautiful way where they can start, because they can draw from the mystical literature. They can draw on the stories and the practices that are alive in the religious community of a client that might have just been through psychedelic psychotherapy for their depression, and they come back and they've touched the face of God. Now, how do you deal with that? Well, a spiritual caregiver could really come in handy. That does require an understanding of what psychedelics are, what they do, and an openness, right? You cannot come as a client, if you come back from a spiritual experience and you're your spiritual caregiver tells you that you had a drug-induced experience and that that's not real grace that you experienced, because grace is given by God and not induced by a drug, then that's a form of, I would say, epistemic harm. Additionally, I think a spiritual caregiver needs to be fully comfortable with embracing and working with doubt. I love this concept of God wrestlers. And I think ultimately also okay with allowing a client to explore if the cultural, religious community is still the place that they want to call home. And we could discern between a spiritual home and a communal home, because you might feel deeply at home in your Christian community, but if you became one with God and your Christian community does not believe that you can become one with God, that there's always a separation between God and his creation, then maybe that's no longer your spiritual home, and you need to start looking for another branch of Christianity, mystical Christianity, or you move to a completely different tradition. And as a spiritual caregiver, personally, I feel you need to work in a client-centered way, and so you need to be able to kind of support your client to move there. Additionally, if you want to guide people through psychedelic experiences, I think there's such an incredible set of other competencies that needs to be trained, that the fact that you're a spiritual caregiver does not prepare you for that. It prepares you to have good conversations about meaning making. You have an intuitive understanding of ethical meaning making, but it doesn't prepare you for someone that is, trembling for 2 hours straight if you don't have experience with holding space for that, that's going to be incredibly difficult. So maybe we can discern between what part of the process are spiritual caregivers helping, and when we talk about spiritual or psychedelic chaplaincy, are we talking about spiritual caregivers that start to do that, or are we talking about people without any spiritual care training that are interested in becoming psychedelic chaplains? And I think those are, we need to bring some clarity in what we're actually talking about.
Thank you so much, Dan. I feel like listening to you is always just such an enlightening experience. And I guess that's what we're trying to do here, is trying to find a little bit of ground for this terminology, as it is so new and emerging. Josh or Ora, does either one of you want to follow?
Yeah, I can speak to that. As we're looking at the landscape and in the United States, the forthcoming approval for psychedelic therapy, as psychedelics are entering the public consciousness and in the mainstream. We also are in the middle of a mental health crisis. There's massive demand for help. And I do feel like psychedelics and the use of them with trained and skilled facilitators can be really useful. But the demand far outweighs those who are able to provide for this. And I think it's important, as laws are being written, that we look at who else out there is able to provide this kind of care. And as you said, Dan, that there's different ways of coming about it. If someone is really skilled at holding that space, at talking through the spiritual questions and the existential questions, what else can be added to that foundation that can qualify people to meet the demand and utilize these medicines for the common good in people, and not just for in the mental health realm. So that's there's a lot of people who have a foundation of that, of the skills involved in walking through this, and with some additional training, and they can meet the demand and I think enter into what we're talking about in terms of psychedelic chaplaincy.
Yeah, thank you. It's like the way I see it also is that the two can support one another, and I think so far the psychedelic community, for the large part, has definitely not considered inviting in or starting to train chaplains or other kinds of ministries or pastors or priests or monks in this journey of doing further psychedelic care. But the way I see it, it's like it's absolutely essential. And maybe the next question that I was curious to ask you is more around this interfaith ministry and also just the concept of interfaith and spiritual care that crosses the boundaries of any particular religion. As maybe for those listeners who are thinking like, oh no, I'm not interested in anything to do with religion, because their immediate association is that anybody who is religious is absolutely dogmatic about their beliefs and will block out everything that contradicts with whatever they have decided to believe in. So I would love for you to speak on this sort of concept of the interfaith and how psychedelics have informed that for you specifically, and also how you see it evolving for yourselves in terms of would you prefer to continue working particularly with, for instance, for you, Josh, with Christian audience, and for you, Aura, with Jewish people primarily, or are you interested in sort of exploring this spiritual care beyond your particular denomination?
All right, I'll I'll leap in first. I was waiting for you to go first. In terms of doing interfaith work, and then I'll come back and address how psychedelics sort of enhances this answer. So in terms of doing interfaith work, my training is not only as a rabbi, it's also as a spiritual director. And that training opens us up to how to be with people, how to provide witness and offer grounded presence to people, no matter what it is that they're bringing, what faith tradition they're carrying, what feelings around that they're carrying. Even no faith tradition is bringing something into that space. So that is part and parcel of some people's training out there that I think is relevant and important. My approach personally to working with people outside of my Jewish tradition is to know that on the one hand, I am grounded in my own tradition, but on the other hand, I carry it lightly into that space because I'm aware that our connection in that moment is going to be, we are two fellow humans, and there is no need for that which grounds me to be that which grounds somebody else. On a conceptual level, one of the ways I'm reminded of that is that the word God itself actually comes from the German word Gott, G-O-T-T, Gott. And Gott is based on the verb meaning that which is evoked. So there's a certain level on which entering into a space that's going to speak to something of spiritual dimensions is going to be talking about, well, what was evoked for you in that experience? Or, how would you like that which was evoked to become more alive for you in the future? So those are some of the ways to work with people. And as for how psychedelics sort of enhances that, for me, my work with psychedelics has opened me even more so to the vastness of what we don't know and what we don't and can't comprehend. Mystery abounds. And there's a certain way in which I find this deeply humbling as a rabbi, as a spiritual person, and to just sit in that sense of humility with others, knowing that in real time as they're speaking to their experience, what they will give voice to is going to be profound. That's the gift that psychedelics has really opened me up to.
Beautifully stated, Aura. I wholeheartedly agree. There's something about working with these medicines that help you to embrace the mystery. And, the opposite of faith isn't doubt, it's certainty. And you can certainly move forward in your faith, holding these doubts and just embracing the mystery that you behold in these encounters. And that's a really helpful experience to have when you're holding this space for other people. I was also learned a lot from a rabbi in a faith-rooted organizing, a community organizing training. And he just talked about the triumphalism he saw, especially in evangelicals. And it was really helpful for me to shed that and to approach interfaith dialogue and friendship with curiosity and openness. And I believe that's really important for this kind of work. It's a personal transformation that I believe needs to happen in the chaplain or the spiritual director or the facilitator. And I think the community that we create amongst ourselves is a really important part of that, to have interfaith collaborators and co-conspirators and to be in dialogue. So I think the interfaith care is important, but I do have people coming to me because I come from a Christian background and I understand that. And I think it's for some that's going to be more, that they'll feel more safe working with somebody who understands where they're coming from. I'm not, as Dan had shared, I'm really open with, as people are feeling like they need to completely deconstruct their religious experience and move on to something else. But I'm also willing to help people if they want to rebuild something and to reconstruct into something that makes sense for them out of their healing from religious trauma or coming out of their experience. And that's how I would say that I'm taking on a more interfaith approach in my work. Interfaith approach rooted in the Christian tradition.
I really love that, Josh. This balance between deconstructing and reconstructing. I think both are so incredibly important in this work, and there's real skill in knowing when someone needs one thing and when they need the other. And sometimes they really think they need to construct, and you're like, and then to do that in a way that is respectful and not pushing them and empowering them. There's real skill to that. I also really appreciate the different ways of working as either interfaith or faith specific. I notice the same. People come to me because of the Buddhist background that I have. And sometimes people come because of a queer background they have. And so I can really imagine that we organize different forms of psychedelic care around particular parts of our identity, whether that's our religious or spiritual identity or sexual identity, or I can even imagine people wanting to organize around other forms of cultural identity, because it can be important to foster a sense of belonging when many people feel so incredibly disconnected. I do think whatever the approach is, that whatever the type of approach we take, that we need to be transparent about who we are, and because we always bring ourselves into the room, even in an interfaith context. I usually say I have this Buddhist background, and I have an interest in the Kabbalah, and I have an interest in Sufism, and I have an interest in I spent quite some time with the not sure how they are called in English, the Followers of Maria. They're a contemplative order in the Catholic Church that practice silence, and so and I'm also a scientist. Like I bring all these things in, and I cannot leave that at the door. And this is my biggest challenge with a lot of the mainstream to the extent that we can call it that, psychedelic care, is that there's this emphasis on neutrality or secularism as if it is existentially neutral, which I don't think is the case. And whatever our approach is, I think we need to have a language and a set of practices that allows us to support our clients making sense of very particular types of experiences. What do you do if a demon shows up? What do you do if people experience something akin to an exorcism? What do you do when they experience profoundly benevolent creatures and deities and entities? If whatever the framework, whatever the cosmology, whatever the existential grounding you're in, whatever concepts or framings or understandings they have, that doesn't really matter, but they need to have an understanding of that. If that is lacking, I think it's going to be very, very challenging to support people in a way that will do justice to what they've experienced. And I think people long for an understanding of some of these experiences where we don't try to kind of like say, oh, that's just an expression of the psychodynamic relationship to your mother. Okay, that's a very particular reductive approach right there. And I'm joking, but unfortunately, it's a joke based on I worked with a client whose psychotherapist made this interpretation of a particular psychedelic experience that he had, and it felt harmful to him not to have such a personal experience really acknowledged. So I'm curious also how because you're very rooted also in your faith traditions, like how if you've found in your own tradition enough space for psychedelic experiences, is the tradition big enough to hold it and all of its complexity and layeredness and transpersonal experiences?
Actually, for me, what that opens up, Dan, is a marvelous opportunity, at least as far as Judaism is concerned, and to the extent that I'm aware. I think we're at the precipice of exciting new chapters in Jewish expression, Jewish thought, Jewish theological development. You know, whether or not psychedelics played a role thousands of years ago as Judaism was practiced then, the way it has been practiced today predominantly has not been necessarily psychedelically informed, at least not in above ground, way that you can go out and, pull a book off a shelf and find obvious things, although there are certainly examples of that. Famous example by Ahuvia, and there are others along the way. But mainstream Judaism has not featured a massive integration of psychedelics into how it invites people into spiritual growth. I think there's a massive opportunity there. And, Judaism has proven itself elastic and resilient because it has been open to new possibilities as those possibilities have arisen throughout history. So I'm kind of excited for what the next period of time might bring and might unfold as we begin to explore.
If I may sort of just put a little side comment to that, I did some research on the origins of the Jewish Renewal movement during my undergraduate, and I actually did find out that there's quite some likelihood that it has some psychedelic origins, the renewal movement itself, which I'm sure you can speak much better to this, but from my understanding is slightly more liberal. There's a bit more sort of a contemporary understanding of the role of genders within the church, and just a more progressive take on Judaism as a general. For those of you who didn't know, go check it out. The Jewish Renewal movement actually does have some psychedelic influence as well.
Yeah, I will just add as just a PS to my comments, since Johanna, you brought it up, the more or less the envisioner of the need for renewing Judaism came in the person of Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, who in the 1960s and 70s traveled around the country helping disaffected, disaffiliated young Jewish people find new means of connection that really resonated for them. It is known now, and it was always, but it's coming more to light now, let's just say, that Reb Zalman experimented a lot with psychedelics, and those really informed his wider lens on what Judaism was and could grow into. And that's kind of what undergirds the movement as we find it today.
Thank you so much for that specification. I just think it's fascinating, so I always want to bring it up when it feels relevant, and it certainly did.
I'll try to be brief. I know we're short on time, but I really see psychedelics falling in line in the mystical lineage of Christianity. We have a long line of mystics from the Desert Fathers in the early church to Celtic saints in Celtic Christianity, like I mentioned before, St. Francis and Clare, and the Rhineland mystics, people like Hildegard of Bingen, Meister Eckhart, Julian of Norwich, St. John of the Cross. And these are all people in the Christian tradition who had direct and personal encounters and experiences with God. And they didn't feel like it was theirs alone. They taught that this was accessible to anybody. And I don't, who knows what occasioned those mystical experiences. Very likely they're meditation practices, and many of them were cloistered. But Hildegard of Bingen was an herbalist, and she was very versed in working with plant medicine. So who knows? There was also a deep, in that lineage, a deep inner transformation. There's a simplicity of life. There's the integration of the contemplative with active engagement with the world. There's also a prophetic sense of that, a prophetic part of that lineage where they were speaking truth to the institution of the church. And I really see this modern integration of psychedelics with Christianity as falling in line with that tradition. I don't think the church is very open. Much of the church is, it's growing. It's becoming more open. And I think too, there's a potential for people who are working with psychedelics within Christianity to have that prophetic word to the institution. The vocation of the church is to see people healed and whole, but it seems like the church is more interested in defending its own version of the truth than to see the healing and wholeness of people. And for any Christian pastors or leaders out there who are listening to this, it's very likely that you will have people in your congregations who are coming to you with these experiences, and you have the opportunity to listen to them, regardless of your own personal feelings of psychedelics. You have the opportunity to listen, to welcome them in. And I believe that the church, with that kind of openness, can be a great place for integration, or it cannot if you don't want to hear it. And I will say that there is this wonderful Christian society, of a psychedelic Christian society called Ligare. The founder of that has been on this podcast before. His name's Hunt Priest. And that is a community where it's safe to have these conversations, where sometimes when one's experience does not quite match up with what we were taught about God, and we can have Ligare is a place where these conversations can happen, and we can see that that discrepancy is not a false choice, that we can integrate our experience into our spirituality.
Beautiful answer, Josh. It's just really so incredibly comprehensive, and I love how you brought into all of these mystics and the sort of forgotten mystical tradition of Christianity, which often goes so past. So maybe we can take a tiny break, and Dan, you can get some water, and we'll just resume. Okay, and we're back from our break. So yeah, this has been such a wonderful and insightful conversation, and I am so grateful for like how you've all been showing up, and especially you, Dan, with COVID. I mean, really, thank you so much for being here with us and sharing your wisdom. Perfect. So I just wanted to say that we're coming towards the end of this conversation, and there's a couple of things that I would love to touch upon, and something that we already talked would be lovely to bring in is the sort of, now that we're watching this psychedelic renaissance evolve and observing the field with all its positives, but also the negatives and the kind of complications and issues that we are running in. And one of the reasons why a training program like Vital exists is so that we can ensure that people have safe experiences, and we're very focused on harm reduction and integration. So in your perspective, how do you see that interfaith care, spiritual care, and also religiosity can serve this movement? And how can we learn from these sort of devotional practices and help them to guide us in this journey of psychedelic care?
Yeah, there's different parts to this answer, I think. I think to use some of the corporate language that has rubbed off on me over the years, I think spiritual caregivers and spiritual directors and chaplains are uniquely positioned within the field to hold a couple of different dimensions together. One model that I've been trained in my spiritual care training is that we're clinically informed. So we're not offering therapy, but we are clinically informed. We've also learned how to really engage our own lives, and so we're very aware of who we are, what we bring, and we're reflective. And then thirdly, we're grounded in one or multiple spiritual, religious, or existential traditions that allows us to offer our clients certain practices and certain language that helps them make sense of things. And one of the things that I think really speaks in favor of religion, as I understand it, and this is a I know that there's a lot of conservatism and simplistic thinking that can be found anywhere. I know we are in a deeply polarized society at the moment, but I genuinely think that at the very least, looking at some of the spiritual traditions that I'm either initiated into or that I have deep familiarity with, is that there's an openness towards mystery, that there's an embrace of complexity, and that there's a capacity, an embodied capacity to stay with difficulty and to stay with complexity. and that there's not a desire to collapse complexity into a simplistic narrative of, oh, the psychedelics gave you what you needed, not what you wanted, which I think is very simplistic. And so I think spiritual caregivers might contribute to insulating the field from harmful meaning-making practices, might insulate it from particular forms of epistemic harm. And I think there's a real need for our profession. Specifically, I say this with the fact in mind that a lot of the medical therapeutic models, although they're incredibly good at what they do, for example, the reduction of depressive symptoms, they seem to be a bit too narrow. And I say that like not super narrow, but a bit too narrow to hold the complexity and the wideness or the broadness or the depth of psychedelic experiences or the psychedelic landscape. And so when there's a lack there, I think a lot of people tend to turn to New Age spirituality, which is a bit of a mishmash of cherry-picked, hallmarkable quotes, the type of quotes you find in your tea bag. And there's a spiritual poverty there that personally I find sad, but I think there's a danger there because it does allow for very charismatic shamans, medicine people, often self-proclaimed, to help their clients and to tell them what's what, and to kind of like impose their worldview and explain to them their experiences rather than empowering people to have their own relationship to their experience. In a similar fashion, I think we see a massive increase in spiritual materialism, where we start to wear our psychedelic experiences as badges, spiritual bypassing, where we long for spiritual narratives and discourse in order to avoid these very human, messy feelings, such as I'm angry, I'm pissed off, I want to take revenge, I feel incredibly vulnerable, I'm horny. Like all these very basic human emotions associated with the body, associated with being in a relationship with others, which is just fucking hard. And so I think that if we're doing a good job as spiritual caregivers, what we can really offer to the field is practices and spaces in which we can embrace complexity and where we can help people become better at ethical meaning making sense of their own lives. And I think that's what we desperately need right now.
Thank you, Daan. That was so eloquently said and very needed. As I reflected on the question, I came up with a list of, I think, 4 things that I would say would enhance the answer you've already heard. One of the gifts that I think religion offers, at least when that religion is working for people and not undermining or harming or that kind of thing. But when religion is working well for people, when people find the right community for them, I think community is one of the gifts that are explorable and can be received. You know, we grow amongst others. We don't grow alone. We need others. We contribute. We develop as human beings when we understand that we have a contribution to make, that contribution matters, and also when we can be seen and heard exactly as we are. And at its ideal, religious communities can offer that sense of community so that we feel like we matter, we feel like we belong, we feel like we're making a contribution, and that we are being received exactly as we are. And that is just so healing. A second way in which I think religion can be helpful And in this, I'll speak specifically to what I know within Judaism, and that is there is a lot of intergenerational repair that that the nature of that work that is just calling and crying out to be done. And after experiencing intergenerational trauma, be it by having to leave generations ago, being thrown out of a place, being attacked from a place. I am the daughter of a Holocaust survivor. That plays into thing. There are all kinds of ways in which healing just is crying out to be experienced. And once again, that the nature of that healing is social. It isn't individual. And so at its ideal, religion can also help us grow and come to terms with that in terms of healing. My third thing was healing itself, but I think I've just spoken to that. And then the fourth and final thing on my list is practice. Religion at its best offers us practices that help us get grounded, that help us get connected on a spiritual level, and that provide for us the means on a daily basis, and sometimes as needed on a minute-by-minute basis, for growing, for healing, for expanding into who we were always meant to become. And it doesn't matter so much what the practices are or what religion you come from. What really matters is that those practices serve to help you get grounded and help you grow, and that committing to them feels good and comfortable and right. And in that way, we can really live into who we were always meant to be.
Beautiful, Aura, and beautiful, Dan. Oh, Josh, yeah, please go ahead.
No, thank you. Those are very thorough answers. I have nothing to add at this time.
Well, I mean, I feel that both of your responses, like in this, you managed to just really convey something that I personally find so hard to get across, just for coming from an experience of what it's been like being raised in a religious home. Because for a lot of other people, it's just like, oh, wow, you must have missed out on a lot. Didn't have TV until I was 13. It's like there's, all these things that people are kind of used to looking at religion through this lens of restriction and limitation. And in a way, it's part of it because, as Dan, you mentioned earlier, it's like there's something about devotion and committing yourself to something that obviously comes along with certain kind of limitations, but that can also be extremely healing and serving for the individual if it's done in the right way. And I think as modernity is just something that, as a principle, this has kind of gone missing. So thank you so much. This has been such an enlightening and enriching dialogue, and I am so grateful that you were able to be here. And I wanted to ask if you have anything that you would like to close off with.
I'd like to do an unorthodox ending. I really hope we can decenter psychedelics in all of this. And what I mean with that is that I think Aura and Josh, you spoke so beautifully to this yearning for belonging, right? The desire to be part of community again, and to also be part of something that is bigger than just us humans, to really feel viscerally that we belong to the more than human world, but also to a transpersonal world, and that we belong within existence. So there might be many different dimensions to this. And one thing that I've seen in a lot of the retreats that I facilitated myself, but also within our ayahuasca church, is people sometimes come back because there's such profound healing in the collective and shared vulnerability, in the experience of communitas, in the sense of togetherness. And I think it can become potentially harmful, especially in the long run, if we start to see these places where people can come kind of like exist over time, if the only way we have access to this is because we're going to take a psychedelic substance. And I think the sooner we decenter psychedelics, the less risk we have thinking that it's about the experiences, and the more we start to realize it's about the relationships that we maintain. And it's not about the shared religion, it's not about the shared experience, it's about the fact that as humans we come together and ask ourselves, what does it mean to be alive right now? And in asking it in a community, we're also partly living that answer. So that would be my closing hope.
That's beautiful, Dan. I wholeheartedly agree. I often tell people that the medicine in a community, I really love this work in community settings, and that the medicine often unlocks the community medicine, the collective medicine, which is more powerful. And I fully feel that. And I'm not saying that the whole Christian church needs to do this. This isn't for everybody, but I'm really curious to see how, as people in the church are experimenting with this, growing, are transformed, how that will change the way that their communities are. And, some might not ever find that their community can hold their experience, but their that encounter with the community medicine, the encounter with an experience of healing in community. The church at its best has that, but I feel like we've lost our course a little bit and have room for renewal. And I wonder what these experiences can bring to the church. I meant to add before that the 20th century theologian Karl Rahner said the Christian of the future will be a mystic, or they won't be anything at all. And that just rings true to me, that the whole religion needs a little more mysticism, needs a little more encounter with the divine. And I hope that happens. And I don't think psychedelics need to be at the center of all of that.
Beautiful. I'm going to close with a short anecdote that's going to speak to what Josh and Dan just said, and that is this: after one of my initial psychedelic experiences, within a matter of weeks, I came back to the office that I am sitting in now. I cleared out maybe half of the books that were in it. I put specific kinds of art on the walls that were going to remind me of that initial journey. And I felt my thoughts begin to declutter. And along with the decluttering, I became aware of what really mattered most to me, that I wanted to be surrounded by, at least in my office. And I started centering those things. And Dan, what I loved about you saying about the need to decenter psychedelics, I think speaks to our core human need that we all share about, we have a core need to belong and to be connected with each other and to feel safe together and loving of each other. And psychedelics can open the doorway to that, but I think you are dead on the money when you say, but it isn't about the psychedelics. I think what we really want is those forms that allow us to feel connected and held, and that sense of deep belonging again. And if psychedelics, as they begin getting used by the general population, they're going to become legal at some point in the near future, maybe just as on an individual level, I was inspired to declutter and start to put at the center what was going to work for me, maybe with society can also start to, declutter and get rid of those forms that aren't working for the sake of making space for the creation of forms that do work, that we do know that we need to help us come into health as a society. That would be very exciting for me. And I just wanted to close by offering my personal gratitude to Johanna for envisioning this conversation, for the creativity you showed in selecting us to be part of this panel, and just what a joy it's been. How satisfying to be able to really come and have a conversation that really feels like it matters in the world with these esteemed colleagues. So thank you so much. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you to all of you. I mean, this was, it exceeded my wildest expectations, and I really feel like we are at some kind of point of shift. And from here onwards, I really hope that we can have more of these kinds of conversations, and that we can continue to support one another in establishing these concrete missions and places where people can come and learn and be held. So thank you so much, and I look forward to the next time when we get to connect. And we'll add all of your information to the information of this conversation. So thank you for sticking through and listening in, and check out our Vital training program. And looking forward to seeing you all soon.
Thanks, Johanna. Bye, all.